I've been carrying this secret for 3 months now, and it's eating me alive from the inside out. Every time I look at my brother David across our family gatherings, every time he talks about our united family with that confident smile of his, I feel like I'm drowning in my own silence. The lawyer's letter is still folded in my purse, the edges worn from my nervous fingers, tracing over it countless times. My name is Margaret. I'm 67 years old, and I've spent my entire life being the responsible one, the peacekeeper, the one who holds this family together while everyone else lives their carefree lives. I raised my children in this same house in suburban Connecticut, where the maple trees turn golden every fall and the neighbors still wave from their perfectly manicured lawns. This is where Dad built his legacy, where he made his fortune in real estate, and where he made the decision that would shatter everything we thought we knew about our family. The house itself tells our story. A classic colonial built in 1952 with white clapboard siding and black shutters that Dad repainted every 3 years like clockwork. The wraparound porch where we spent summer evenings drinking sweet tea and watching fireflies dance across the lawn. The kitchen with its checkered linoleum floors where Mom taught me to make her famous apple pie, the same recipe I've been making for Christmas dinner for the past 15 years since she passed. David doesn't know. God help me. David doesn't know that Dad cut him out completely. Not a single dollar, not the family business, not even the old pocket watch that belonged to our grandfather, the one David used to wind every Sunday when we were kids, pretending to be a grown-up businessman like Dad. Everything, and I mean everything, comes to me. The house with its creaking stairs and drafty windows, the company that Dad built from nothing into a multi-million-dollar enterprise, the investment portfolio that took him 40 years to accumulate, even his personal belongings, down to his collection of vintage baseball cards. All because of what Dad discovered about David's gambling debts, about the money he'd been stealing from the company accounts for the past 2 years, about the lies he'd been telling us all while Sarah worked double shifts at the hospital to keep their family afloat. The private investigator's report was thorough. Casino receipts, bank statements, forged signatures on company checks. Dad had hired the best, and they'd found everything. I remember the day Dad called me to his study, that wood-paneled room that smelled of leather and Old Spice cologne. He was sitting behind his massive oak desk, the same one where he'd helped me with homework 40 years ago, and his hands were shaking as he handed me the investigator's folder. "Margaret," he said, his voice heavy with disappointment, "I need you to see what your brother has been doing to our family." The photos were devastating. David at the Mohegan Sun Casino at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. The same Tuesday he'd told Sarah he was working late at the office. Bank statements showing withdrawals of thousands of dollars from the company account, all authorized with Dad's forged signature. Credit card bills for cash advances that totaled more than most people make in a year. It was a systematic betrayal that had been going on right under our noses. I've watched my brother these past months, seen him make plans for the future, talking about expanding the business, about the renovations he wants to make to this old house. He has no idea that Dad spent his final weeks rewriting his will, that he hired the best estate attorney in Hartford, that he found out everything and made his decision with a broken heart. The disappointment in Dad's eyes during those last days still haunts me. He made me promise not to tell David until after the funeral, said he wanted one last peaceful Christmas with the family before everything fell apart. But now Christmas has come and gone, and I'm still keeping this secret. Because once I tell him, once that letter comes out of my purse, our family will never be the same again. The question that keeps me awake at night, staring at the ceiling of the bedroom where I grew up, is simple. How do you tell someone you love that the father they idolized saw them as a disappointment? How do you destroy someone's entire world with a single piece of paper? The worst part is watching him plan for a future that will never exist, and knowing that I'm the one who has to take it all away from him. The moment came during our Christmas dinner, right there at Dad's old mahogany table with the good china and Mom's silver candlesticks casting shadows across our faces. The dining room was decorated exactly the way Mom used to do it. Garland draped along the mantelpiece, the nativity scene she'd collected piece by piece over 30 years displayed on the sideboard, and the smell of cinnamon and pine filling the air from the potpourri simmering on the stove. David had just finished carving the turkey, Dad's job for 40 years, and he raised his wine glass with that boyish grin that used to make everyone forgive his mistakes. He was wearing Dad's old Christmas sweater, the red one with the reindeer that we used to tease him about, and for a moment he looked exactly like our father did 20 years ago, full of pride and surrounded by the family he loved. "To our family," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Dad always said we were stronger together, and even though he's not here with us, I can feel his presence in this room. We're going to honor his memory by keeping everything he built intact. The business, this house, all of it. We're a united family, and nothing will ever change that." I felt the blood drain from my face. My sister-in-law Sarah was nodding enthusiastically, her nurse's uniform replaced by the green dress she only wore for special occasions. My nephew Jake was smiling, home from his sophomore year at UConn, talking about how proud Grandpa would be of his business major. Even my own daughter Emma was raising her glass, her eyes bright with unshed tears as she remembered the grandfather who taught her to drive in the church parking lot and slipped her $20 bills when her mother wasn't looking. The lawyer's letter felt like it was burning a hole through my purse, which sat innocently on the kitchen counter just 20 feet away, next to the ceramic cookie jar shaped like a snowman that Mom had bought at a church bazaar decades ago. I managed to lift my glass with a trembling hand, but I couldn't speak. The words stuck in my throat like broken glass. I just swallowed hard and prayed that my face didn't betray the turmoil raging inside me. The Connecticut winter wind rattled the old windows, the same windows Dad had been meaning to replace for years, but never got around to. Outside, snow was beginning to fall again, covering the neighborhood in that pristine white blanket that made everything look like a Christmas card. Mrs. Patterson's house across the street was lit up with enough Christmas lights to power a small city, and I could see the Hendersons' kids building a snowman in their front yard. Everything felt so normal, so perfectly American and traditional, like a scene from one of those Hallmark movies Sarah loved to watch. The turkey was golden brown and perfectly carved. The mashed potatoes were creamy with just the right amount of butter, and Sarah's famous stuffing, made with Mom's secret recipe that included Italian sausage and dried cranberries, was disappearing fast. But I was living in a nightmare, watching my brother make toast after toast about family unity while I held the power to destroy everything he believed in. After dinner, David cornered me in the kitchen while I was loading the dishwasher with Mom's good china, the set with the tiny blue flowers that she'd saved for special occasions and that I now used every Christmas in her memory. The kitchen was warm and steamy from all the cooking, and the window above the sink was fogged up from the contrast between the heated house and the cold December night. "Maggie," he said, using the nickname only he was allowed to use, the one that made me feel like I was 8 years old again. "I know this has been hard on you, being the executor and all. Dad put a lot of responsibility on your shoulders, and I want you to know how grateful I am that he trusted you with everything. You've always been the strong one, the one who keeps us all together." He leaned against the counter where Mom used to roll out pie crusts, his sleeves rolled up and his tie loosened, looking more relaxed than I'd seen him in months. "When we go through the will reading next week, I just want you to know that whatever Dad decided, I'm okay with it. He was fair his whole life, treated us both equally, and I know he'll be fair now. Probably left us each half of everything, right? That's what I'd do." I dropped the plate I was holding. It shattered against the ceramic tile floor that Dad had installed himself 20 years ago, the sound echoing through the kitchen like a gunshot. The pieces scattered across the floor, some sliding under the refrigerator, others coming to rest near the dog bowl that still sat in the corner, even though we'd had to put Rusty down 6 months before Dad died. David immediately knelt down to help me clean up the pieces, his hands gentle as always, careful not to cut himself on the sharp edges. "Hey, it's okay," he said softly. "It's just a plate. Mom would understand. She broke plenty of dishes in her time, remember? That's why she always bought extras of everything." I almost broke down right there, watching him carefully pick up each shard while talking about Mom's practical wisdom, completely unaware that in a few days I'd be picking up the pieces of something much more precious and much more impossible to repair. The kindness in his voice, the way he was protecting me from the sharp edges while I held the power to cut him deeper than any broken dish ever could. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of the dishwasher and the distant laughter from the dining room where the rest of the family was sharing Christmas memories. "I'm just tired." But as I watched him carefully sweep up the last fragments and dispose of them in the trash can under the sink, I realized that soon I'd be sweeping up the pieces of our entire family, and no amount of care or gentleness would be able to put us back together again. What would you do in my place? Would you have told him right then and there, with the whole family celebrating in the next room? Don't forget to subscribe and hit that like button if you're as torn as I am about this impossible situation. The days after Christmas crawled by like a slow-motion nightmare, each one heavier than the last. Every phone call from David felt like a dagger to my heart, and he called often, sometimes about business matters, sometimes just to check on me, always with that warm, caring voice that made my guilt feel like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. Our small Connecticut town suddenly felt claustrophobic in ways I'd never experienced before. Millbrook had always been my sanctuary, a place where everyone knew everyone, and the biggest drama was usually about who forgot to bring dessert to the church potluck. But now, every familiar corner held the potential for an encounter I wasn't ready for. The local diner where David and I used to meet for coffee every Tuesday morning became a place I actively avoided. Murphy's Diner, with its red vinyl booths and the waitress who'd been serving us the same coffee and blueberry muffins for 15 years, felt like a minefield. I started taking different routes to the grocery store, avoiding Main Street entirely. The hardware store where David worked part-time on weekends, helping old Mr. Kowalski with the heavier lifting since his arthritis got bad, became another place I couldn't bear to visit. I'd drive the extra 20 minutes to the big box store in the next town over, just to avoid the possibility of seeing him in his work apron, whistling while he organized paint cans or helped customers find the right screws for their home projects. Even church became unbearable. St. Hugh, Mary's Catholic Church, where our family had attended Mass every Sunday for 3 generations, where David and I had been baptized and confirmed, where we'd both been married, and where we'd said goodbye to Mom and Dad. It all felt tainted now. Father Mackenzie kept asking about David, wondering why he hadn't been to Mass lately, and I had to make excuses about him being busy with work. The truth was, I'd been the one avoiding church, unable to sit in that familiar pew and pretend to pray while carrying such a devastating secret. Mrs. Henderson from down the street kept stopping by with casseroles and concerned questions. She'd known our family since we were children, had watched David and me grow up, had celebrated our successes and comforted us through our losses. "Margaret, dear," she'd say, standing on my front porch with another aluminum pan covered in foil. "You look pale and thin. Are you eating enough? Are you sleeping? Maybe you should talk to someone about your grief." How could I explain that I wasn't just grieving Dad's death, but grieving the destruction of everything our family had been? How could I tell her that I was slowly being consumed by a secret that felt like poison in my veins? That every day I didn't tell David the truth was another day I was betraying him? My own daughter Emma started noticing the change in me during her daily check-in calls. She lived in Boston now, working as a marketing executive for a tech company, but she called every evening at 7 o'clock sharp, a habit she'd developed after Dad's funeral. "Mom, you're scaring me," she said one afternoon, her voice filled with the same concern I used to have for her when she was little and afraid of thunderstorms. "You haven't been yourself since Dad died. Your voice sounds different, hollow somehow. Maybe you should talk to Dr. Patterson about getting some help for depression." But how could I talk to anyone? How could I explain that I was watching my brother live in a fantasy, making plans that would crumble to dust the moment I opened my mouth? Dr. Patterson had been our family physician for 20 years, had delivered Emma, had held Dad's hand during his final moments. He knew our family's history, our dynamics, our love for each other. How could I sit in his office and explain that I was about to destroy the person I loved most in this world? David had started talking about hiring new staff for the company, about expanding into commercial real estate, about taking Sarah on that cruise to Alaska she'd been dreaming about for years. He'd even started looking at brochures for Jake's spring break trip to Europe, talking about how proud Dad would be to see his grandson experiencing the world. Each plan was another nail in my coffin of guilt, another reminder of how completely unprepared he was for what was coming. The worst part was the way he looked at me during our brief encounters, with such gratitude, such trust, such unshakable faith in our bond as siblings. "I don't know what I'd do without you, Maggie," he'd say, squeezing my hand with those calloused fingers that had worked alongside Dad in the business for 20 years. "You're the strong one in this family. You always have been. Dad knew that, and that's why he trusted you with everything. If only he knew that his strong sister was falling apart, that I spent most nights pacing the hardwood floors of Dad's old house, rehearsing conversations I'd never have the courage to start. The house felt different now, filled with shadows and secrets, instead of the warmth and love that had defined it for so many years. Every room held memories of David. The living room where we'd played board games as children, the kitchen where he'd helped Mom with holiday cooking, the study where Dad had taught him about business and responsibility. I found myself doing strange things to cope with the overwhelming guilt. I'd drive to Riverside Cemetery at odd hours, sitting by Dad's grave and asking him why he'd put this burden on me. The headstone was simple granite with his name, dates, and the inscription, "Beloved Father and Grandfather," words that felt like mockery now, knowing how his love had been conditional, how his disappointment had led to such a devastating decision. I'd pull out the lawyer's letter and read it over and over, hoping the words would somehow change, that I'd discover some clause or condition that might give David something, anything, to soften the blow. But Mr. Peterson had been thorough in his explanation. Dad's wishes were ironclad, legally binding, and there was nothing I could do to change them. The January snow was falling harder now, covering our small town in a blanket of white that made everything look peaceful and pure from the outside. But inside my heart, there was nothing but darkness and the growing certainty that I was about to destroy the person I loved most in this world, and that our family would never recover from what was coming. The will reading was scheduled for January 15th, just 3 weeks away, and I knew I couldn't let David walk into that lawyer's office unprepared. The thought of him hearing the truth for the first time in front of strangers, in that cold, sterile conference room with its leather chairs and mahogany table, made me physically sick. He deserved better than that. He deserved to hear it from me, in private, with love and compassion, in a place where he could fall apart without judgment. But every time I picked up the phone to call him, my hands would shake so violently I couldn't dial the numbers. Every time I drove toward his house, that modest colonial on Elm Street where he and Sarah had raised their kids, with the basketball hoop he'd installed when Jake was 10 and the flower garden Sarah tended every spring, I'd turn around before reaching his driveway, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might have a heart attack. I was a coward, plain and simple, and I hated myself for it. Here I was, 67 years old, a woman who had raised 2 children as a single mother after my husband died, who had run the household finances and helped Dad with the business books for years, who had been strong for everyone else my entire life, and I couldn't find the courage to have one honest conversation with my own brother. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in early January, when David showed up at my door unannounced, holding 2 cups of coffee from Murphy's Diner and wearing that infectious smile that had gotten him out of trouble his whole life. The January air was crisp and clean, so cold it made your breath visible in little puffs, and his cheeks were red from the walk from his car to my front door. "Thought you might need some caffeine," he said, stepping into the warm foyer where Dad's old coat still hung on the wooden rack, that heavy wool overcoat he'd worn to church every Sunday for 30 years, the one that still smelled faintly of his aftershave, and the peppermints he always kept in the pockets. "I know you've been having trouble sleeping. Sarah noticed you had your lights on pretty late when she drove by last week." I took the coffee with numb fingers, the warmth of the cup a stark contrast to the ice in my veins. He was wearing Dad's old flannel shirt, the red and black checkered one that Dad had given him for Christmas 5 years ago, and seeing him in it made my chest tighten with emotion. He looked so much like Dad in that moment. The same broad shoulders, the same way of standing with his hands in his pockets, the same gentle eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. "I've been thinking about the business expansion we discussed," he continued, settling into Dad's old recliner like he belonged there, like he'd been sitting in that chair his whole life instead of just the past few months since Dad died. The chair still held the impression of Dad's body, still had the small burn mark on the armrest from where he'd accidentally dropped his pipe 20 years ago. I know Dad would want us to take some risks, really grow the company into something bigger than he ever imagined. He was so animated, so full of plans and dreams, gesturing with his free hand as he talked about market opportunities and growth strategies. His eyes lit up when he talked about the future, about the possibilities that lay ahead for our family business. This was David at his best, enthusiastic, optimistic, completely convinced that the world was full of opportunities just waiting to be seized. "I've been talking to some investors downtown, and they're really interested in what we're doing," he continued, pulling out a folder full of business plans and financial projections. The timing is perfect, Maggie. With the inheritance money, we'll have the capital to really make moves. I know Dad was conservative with his investments. He had to be, growing up during the Depression and all. But I think he'd be proud to see us taking the company to the next level. He spread the papers out on the coffee table, the same table where we'd done homework as children, where Mom had served countless cups of tea to church ladies and neighbors. The business plans were detailed and professional, clearly the result of weeks of work and research. He'd even included charts and graphs showing projected growth over the next 5 years, all based on the assumption that he'd have access to Dad's money. Look at this, he said, pointing to a particular chart with obvious pride. If we expand into commercial real estate like I'm suggesting, we could double our revenue within 2 years, maybe even triple it. Jake could come work for us after college, really make it a 3-generation business like Dad always dreamed. The enthusiasm in his voice was heartbreaking. He was building castles in the air, creating elaborate plans for a future that would never exist, and I was the only person who knew it. Every projection, every calculation, every dream was based on money he would never see, on an inheritance that had been taken away from him before he even knew it existed. The best part is, we'd be honoring Dad's memory while also securing the family's future, he said, his voice thick with emotion. He worked so hard to build something lasting, something that would take care of all of us. This expansion would be his legacy living on, growing into something even bigger than he imagined. That's when I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I couldn't let him keep building these elaborate plans, couldn't watch him invest more time and energy and hope into something that was never going to happen. The lawyer's letter felt heavier than ever in my pocket, and I realized that my silence had become its own form of cruelty. David deserved the truth, even if it destroyed him, even if it destroyed us both. I set down my coffee cup with a trembling hand and looked into his trusting brown eyes, the same eyes that used to look up at me when he was 5 years old and I was helping him tie his shoes, the same eyes that had looked to me for guidance and support our entire lives. "David," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "we need to talk. Would you have waited longer, or would you have told him right then? What would you do in my place? Subscribe and let me know in the comments. I need all the support I can get for what comes next." The words hung in the air between us like a death sentence, heavy and final and irreversible. David's smile faded slowly, like a photograph left too long in the sun, replaced by a look of confusion that broke my heart into 1,000 pieces. He set down his coffee cup on the table next to his business plans, the sound of ceramic against wood unnaturally loud in the sudden silence that filled the room. "What do you mean, Maggie? What do we need to talk about?" His voice carried just the slightest tremor, the instinctive fear that comes when someone you love uses that particular tone, the one that means everything is about to change, and not for the better. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the lawyer's letter, its edges soft from handling, the envelope worn from being folded and unfolded countless times over the past 3 months. The paper felt like it weighed 100 pounds, like it contained all the pain and disappointment and shattered dreams that were about to spill out into this room where we'd shared so many happy memories. Outside, the Connecticut winter was painting frost patterns on the windows, delicate crystalline designs that would melt away as soon as the sun hit them. The old house creaked and settled around us like it was holding its breath, waiting for the moment when everything would change forever. I could hear the furnace kicking on in the basement, the same furnace Dad had installed 15 years ago, the one David had helped him carry down those narrow stairs. "David, there's something about Dad's will that you need to know before we go to the reading next week." My voice sounded strange to my own ears, hollow and distant, like it was coming from someone else entirely. "Something that's going to be very difficult to hear." His face went pale, the color draining from his cheeks like water from a broken dam. I watched as his mind started racing through possibilities, trying to find an explanation that wouldn't be catastrophic. His hands, those strong hands that had worked alongside Dad for 20 years, began to shake slightly as he clasped them together in his lap. "Is it bad? I mean, how bad could it be?" The hope in his voice was desperate, clinging to the possibility that whatever I was about to tell him could be managed, could be fixed, could be something less than devastating. Did he leave more to charity than we expected? Because that would be okay, you know. Dad earned the right to do whatever he wanted with his money. He worked hard his whole life, and if he wanted to give it all away to help people, I'd respect that decision. The innocence in his voice was like a knife twisting in my chest. He was still trying to find ways to make this okay, still believing in the father who had raised him, still trusting in the fairness and love he'd been promised his whole life. Even faced with the possibility of bad news, his first instinct was to find a way to honor Dad's memory, to make peace with whatever decision had been made. Maybe he left the business to you and the house to me, or vice versa, he continued, his voice getting faster as he tried to work through the possibilities. That would make sense, actually. You've always been better with the financial side of things, and I've always been more hands-on with the actual work. We could make that arrangement work, couldn't we? We've always been a good team. I had to stop him before he built up any more hope, before he convinced himself that whatever I was about to tell him could be survived. The truth was going to hit him like a freight train, and every second I delayed was just making the impact worse. Dad left everything to me. The house, the business, the investments, his personal belongings, everything. The words came out in a rush, like I was ripping off a bandage, trying to get the pain over with as quickly as possible. You're not mentioned in the will at all. Not anywhere. It's like he forgot you existed. The silence that followed was deafening, so complete that I could hear the clock ticking on the mantelpiece, the same clock that had marked time in this room for 40 years. I watched the color drain completely from his face, watched his hands start to shake more violently, watched 43 years of certainty crumble in real time. His mouth opened and closed several times, like he was trying to speak but couldn't find the words, like he was drowning in the impossibility of what I'd just told him. That's not possible, he finally whispered, his voice so quiet I had to strain to hear him. Dad wouldn't do that. There has to be some mistake. Maybe there's another will, a more recent one, or maybe the lawyer made an error when he was typing it up. Dad always said we were equal in his eyes. He always said that family was the most important thing, that blood was thicker than water. The desperation in his voice was heartbreaking. He was grasping at straws, trying to find any explanation that would make sense of the senseless, that would restore the world he'd always known to its proper order. But I couldn't let him live in that fantasy any longer. He needed to know the whole truth, no matter how much it hurt. There's no mistake, David. Dad hired a private investigator. He found out about the gambling, about the money you took from the company accounts, about all of it. Each word felt like I was driving nails into his coffin, but I couldn't stop now. The truth had to come out, all of it, no matter how devastating. He was heartbroken. He felt betrayed, and he decided that he couldn't trust you with the family legacy. David's face went through a series of emotions: shock, denial, understanding, and finally a pain so deep and raw it was almost unbearable to witness. He buried his face in his hands, and his shoulders began to shake with silent sobs that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul. "Oh God," he whispered through his fingers, his voice muffled and broken. "Oh God, Maggie, what have I done? What have I done to our family?" And that's when I realized that the hardest part wasn't telling him the truth. The hardest part was what came next, watching the brother I loved more than life itself fall apart completely, watching him confront the full magnitude of his mistakes and their consequences, and knowing that there was nothing I could do to put him back together again. The damage was done, the trust was broken, and our family would never be the same. The days that followed our conversation were like watching a man slowly drown in plain sight. David didn't leave my house that Tuesday morning. He couldn't. After the initial shock wore off, after the tears stopped flowing, he just sat in Dad's old recliner staring at nothing, his business plans scattered on the coffee table like the remnants of a shattered dream. "How long have you known?" he asked finally, his voice hoarse from crying. The question I'd been dreading, the one that would reveal my own complicity in his pain. 3 months, I whispered, unable to meet his eyes. "Since right after the funeral. Mr. Peterson gave me the letter that day, told me Dad's instructions were to wait until after Christmas to tell you." The look he gave me then was worse than his initial shock. It was betrayal, pure and simple. 3 months, Maggie? You've known for 3 months and you let me make all those plans, talk about the future, get excited about expanding the business? His voice was rising now, anger mixing with the pain. "You watched me make a fool of myself, talking about honoring Dad's legacy when he'd already decided I wasn't worthy of it. I wanted to explain, to tell him about the sleepless nights, the guilt that had been eating me alive, the way I'd agonized over every conversation we'd had. But how could I make him understand that my silence had come from love, not cruelty? How could I explain that watching him be happy, even if it was based on a lie, had seemed kinder than destroying him during the holidays? I didn't know how to tell you, I said weakly. I kept thinking there had to be a better way, a gentler way. I couldn't bear the thought of ruining Christmas for everyone. So instead you ruined everything, he said, standing up abruptly and walking to the window that overlooked the backyard where we'd played as children. The snow was falling heavier now, covering the swing set Dad had built for the grandchildren, the garden where Mom had grown her prized tomatoes. Do you have any idea what this means, Maggie? I've been planning to quit my part-time job at the hardware store. I've been telling Sarah we could finally take that cruise, that we could help Jake with his college expenses without worrying about money. The weight of his words hit me like a physical blow. I hadn't just been keeping a secret. I'd been allowing him to make decisions based on false information, to build hopes and dreams that were destined to crumble. The cruise brochures Sarah had been collecting, the college fund they'd been planning to establish, the business expansion that would never happen. All of it was my fault as much as his. I need to see the investigator's report, he said suddenly, turning back to face me. I need to know exactly what Dad found out, exactly how much he knew. I retrieved the folder from Dad's study, the same folder that had been sitting in his desk drawer like a time bomb for months. David's hands shook as he opened it, and I watched his face change as he read through the evidence of his own destruction. Bank statements, casino receipts, forged signatures. It was all there, documented with the thoroughness of a criminal investigation. Jesus Christ, he breathed, staring at a photograph of himself at the blackjack table. He had me followed, his own son, and he had me followed like a common criminal. He was trying to understand, I said, though the words sounded hollow even to me. He couldn't figure out why the company accounts weren't adding up, why there were discrepancies in the books. He thought maybe someone was embezzling, maybe one of the employees was stealing. And instead he found out it was his own son. David's laugh was bitter, devoid of any humor. Do you know what the worst part is, Maggie? It's not that he cut me out of the will. It's that he died thinking I was a thief and a liar. He died disappointed in me, and I never got the chance to explain, to apologize, to try to make it right. The pain in his voice was unbearable. I wanted to comfort him, to tell him that Dad had loved him despite everything, but I couldn't lie to him anymore. The truth was that Dad had died heartbroken, feeling betrayed by the son he'd trusted with his business and his legacy. I have to tell Sarah, David said suddenly, the color draining from his face again. Oh God, I have to tell Sarah and Jake. They're going to find out at the will reading anyway, and they deserve to hear it from me first. I watched him gather up his business plans, his hands moving mechanically as he stacked the papers that represented months of work and hope. The charts and graphs that had seemed so promising an hour ago now looked like the fantasies of a desperate man, and I realized that this was just the beginning of the devastation that would ripple through our entire family. David, I called, as he headed toward the door. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for all of this. He paused with his hand on the doorknob, his back still turned to me. I know you are, Maggie. But sorry doesn't change anything, does it? Sorry doesn't bring Dad back so I can explain. Sorry doesn't erase the fact that I destroyed everything he worked for. And sorry doesn't fix the fact that my own sister watched me make a fool of myself for 3 months. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and I was left alone in the house that no longer felt like home, surrounded by the ghosts of everything our family used to be. What would you have done differently? Should I have told him sooner, or was I right to wait? Subscribe, and let me know in the comments, because the hardest part is still coming. The will reading was a nightmare I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. Mr. Peterson's law office on Main Street had always seemed like a place of dignity and respect, with its dark wood paneling and leather-bound books, but that morning it felt like a courtroom where my family was being sentenced to a lifetime of pain. Sarah arrived looking confused and hopeful, wearing her best dress and carrying a small notebook where she'd written down questions about estate taxes and inheritance procedures. She'd taken the morning off from her job at Hartford Hospital, arranging for someone else to cover her shift in the cardiac unit because she thought this was going to be a celebration of Dad's legacy, a formal acknowledgement of the security he'd provided for all of us. Jake had driven down from Yukon, missing his morning classes because David had told him this was important family business. At 20 years old, he still had that optimistic view of the world that comes from being loved and protected, from growing up in a family where the adults handled the difficult things and children were free to dream about their futures. I watched David's face as Mr. Peterson read through the will, watched him try to maintain his composure as the lawyer's voice droned through the legal language that systematically excluded him from everything. Sarah's confusion was painful to witness. She kept looking from David to me to the lawyer, trying to understand why her husband's name wasn't being mentioned, why all of Dad's assets were going to his sister instead of being divided between his children. "I don't understand," she said finally, her voice small and uncertain. "There must be some mistake. Mr. Peterson, could you please read that part again about the business?" The lawyer's expression was professionally neutral, but I could see the discomfort in his eyes. He'd known our family for years, had handled Dad's legal affairs since the 1980s, and this couldn't have been easy for him either. "Mrs. Sullivan, the will is quite clear. All business assets, including Sullivan and Associates real estate, are bequeathed to Margaret Sullivan, along with all personal property and financial assets." Jake spoke up then, his young voice cutting through the tension in the room. "But what about Dad? Grandpa always said the business would stay in the family. Dad's been working there since he graduated high school. He knows everything about the company." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the traffic outside on Main Street, the normal sounds of a small town going about its business, while our family fell apart in this wood-paneled room. David reached over and took his son's hand, and I saw him struggle to find the words to explain the unexplainable. "Son," he said quietly, "Grandpa made his decision based on information he had about some mistakes I made. This is my fault, not anyone else's." Sarah's face went through a series of emotions as understanding began to dawn. She was a smart woman, a registered nurse who dealt with crisis situations every day, and I watched her put the pieces together. The late nights David had been working, the financial stress they'd been under, despite the business doing well, the way he'd been so excited about the inheritance money, it all started to make sense to her in the worst possible way. "David," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "what did you do?" The drive home from the lawyer's office was the longest 20 minutes of my life. I kept thinking about Jake's face when David finally told him about the gambling, about the money that had been taken from the company. The boy's world had crumbled in real time, watching his father transform from a hero into a stranger, watching his grandfather's love revealed to be conditional after all. That evening, David called me from his house. I could hear Sarah crying in the background, and his voice was hollow, defeated. "She wants to know how we're going to pay the mortgage," he said. "I've been telling her for months that we didn't need to worry about money anymore, that Dad's inheritance would take care of everything. Now she's looking at our bank statements, trying to figure out how we're going to survive." The practical implications of Dad's decision were becoming clear. David's salary from the company had been modest because he'd always expected to inherit ownership. They'd been living paycheck to paycheck, counting on the inheritance to provide security for their retirement, for Jake's education, for all the dreams they'd built together over 23 years of marriage. "I don't know what to do, Maggie," he continued, and I could hear the desperation in his voice. "I can't ask you for money. That would just make everything worse. But I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to undo 20 years of mistakes." I wanted to help him, wanted to find some way to make this right, but I was trapped by Dad's decision just as much as he was. The will was ironclad, and even if I wanted to give David half of everything, the legal and tax implications would be complicated and expensive. More importantly, I wasn't sure it would solve the real problem, the broken trust, the shattered relationships, the knowledge that our father had died disappointed in his son. "Maybe we can work something out with the business," I said, though I wasn't sure what that would look like. "You know the company better than anyone. Maybe you could stay on as manager, or we could set up some kind of partnership agreement." "You don't understand," he said, his voice breaking. "It's not about the money, not really. It's about what this means. Dad didn't just cut me out of his will, he cut me out of his heart. He decided I wasn't worthy of being his son anymore, and now everyone knows it. How do I face the people in this town? How do I go to church on Sunday knowing that everyone's talking about how Frank Sullivan's boy turned out to be a disappointment?" The pain in his voice was unbearable, and I realized that the financial devastation was only part of the damage. In a small town like Millbrook, reputation was everything, and Dad's will was a public declaration that his son had failed him. The gossip would spread quickly. It probably already had, starting from Mr. Peterson's secretary and radiating out through the network of relationships that connected everyone in our community. That night, I sat in Dad's study, surrounded by the evidence of his success, the awards from the Chamber of Commerce, the photos with local politicians, the thank you letters from satisfied clients. But all I could think about was the broken man on the other end of that phone call and the family that would never be whole again. 2 weeks after the will reading, David showed up at my door at 6 in the morning, looking like he hadn't slept in days. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair uncombed, and there was a wildness in his eyes that scared me. Sarah's car wasn't in the driveway behind him, and I realized with a sinking heart that she must have asked him to leave. "We need to talk," he said, pushing past me into the house without waiting for an invitation. "Really talk this time, not like before when you were still keeping secrets." I followed him into the living room, where he began pacing back and forth like a caged animal. The morning light streaming through the windows showed just how much weight he'd lost, how the stress of the past few weeks had aged him. This wasn't the brother I'd known my whole life. This was a man on the edge of complete breakdown. "Sarah took Jake and went to her sister's house in Hartford," he said, without preamble. "She says she needs time to think, to figure out if she can trust me anymore. 23 years of marriage, Maggie, and she's not sure she can trust me." I wanted to comfort him, to tell him that Sarah would come around, that their marriage was strong enough to survive this crisis. But I'd seen the look in Sarah's eyes at the will reading, the way she'd stared at her husband like he was a stranger. Trust, once broken, was not easily repaired. "I've been thinking about what Dad must have felt when he found out," David continued, his voice getting louder, more agitated. "His own son, stealing from him, lying to his face every day. Do you know what that must have done to him? Do you know how that must have broken his heart?" "David, you need to calm down," I said, but he wasn't listening. "No, I don't need to calm down," he shouted, spinning around to face me. "I need to understand how we got here. I need to understand how I became the kind of person who would steal from his own father, who would gamble away his family's security, who would lie to everyone he loved." The pain in his voice was raw, primal, like an animal caught in a trap. I'd never seen him like this, not even when Mom died, not even during the worst moments of his life. This was different. This was a man confronting the full magnitude of his failures, and it was destroying him. "I keep thinking about that last conversation I had with Dad," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. 3 days before he died, he asked me about the company accounts. He said the numbers didn't look right, asked if I knew anything about some discrepancies, and I looked him right in the eye and lied. I told him everything was fine, that maybe the bookkeeper had made some mistakes. He collapsed into Dad's recliner, burying his face in his hands. He knew, didn't he? He already knew I was lying, but he gave me one last chance to tell the truth, and I blew it. I chose to lie to him on his deathbed rather than face what I'd done. The guilt in his voice was overwhelming, and I realized that this was what had been eating him alive, not just the financial consequences of Dad's decision, but the knowledge that he'd failed his father in the most fundamental way possible. He'd betrayed the man who'd raised him, taught him, trusted him with the family business, and then he'd lied about it until the very end. "He loved you, David," I said, though the words felt inadequate. "Even after he found out, even when he was changing the will, he still loved you. That's why he waited until after Christmas to have you told. He wanted one last holiday with his family intact." "Love?" David's laugh was bitter, harsh. "If he loved me, he would have confronted me. He would have given me a chance to explain, to apologize, to try to make it right. Instead, he hired a private investigator like I was some kind of criminal. He treated me like a stranger, not like his son. I wanted to argue with him, to defend Dad's decision, but I couldn't. The truth was that Dad's response had been cold, calculated, designed to protect his assets rather than save his son. There had been no intervention, no family meeting, no attempt at reconciliation, just a quiet investigation followed by a devastating punishment. "Maybe he was protecting himself," I said quietly. "Maybe he couldn't bear to confront you because he knew it would destroy him to hear you admit what you'd done. Or maybe he just stopped loving me," David replied, his voice flat and emotionless. Maybe he decided I wasn't worth saving. The silence that followed was heavy with years of pain and disappointment, with the weight of decisions that couldn't be undone and words that couldn't be taken back. I looked at my brother, really looked at him, and saw not the successful businessman he'd pretended to be, not the loving father and husband he'd tried to remain, but a broken man who'd lost everything that mattered to him. "I don't know how to live with this, Maggie," he said finally. "I don't know how to wake up every morning knowing that I destroyed everything Dad built, that I ruined my marriage, that I disappointed my son. I don't know how to be the kind of person who could do those things." And in that moment, I realized that the real tragedy wasn't the money or the business or even the broken trust. The real tragedy was watching someone I loved lose himself completely, watching him struggle to find a way to exist in a world where he could no longer respect the person he saw in the mirror. How do you forgive yourself for the unforgivable? How do you rebuild a life when you've destroyed everything you held dear? Subscribe and share your thoughts, because sometimes the hardest person to face is yourself. 6 months have passed since that terrible morning when David broke down in my living room, and I'm sitting here in Dad's old study, watching the autumn leaves fall outside the window, thinking about how much can change in such a short time. The maple tree in the backyard is turning that brilliant gold that Connecticut is famous for, and for the first time since Dad died, I can look at it without feeling the crushing weight of secrets and guilt. David didn't disappear the way I feared he might. Instead, he did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He got help. Real help, not just the kind of surface-level counseling that people do to check a box, but the deep, painful work of understanding how he'd become someone he didn't recognize. He started going to Gamblers Anonymous meetings in Hartford, driving the 40 minutes each way 3 times a week, sitting in church basements and community centers with other people who'd lost themselves to addiction. Sarah came back after 2 months, but not to the same marriage they'd had before. They're in counseling together now, working through 20 years of financial stress and broken promises, learning how to rebuild trust from the ground up. It's not easy. I can see the strain in both their faces when they come to Sunday dinner, but they're trying. And that's more than I dared hope for during those dark weeks in January. Jake transferred to a state school to save money, giving up his dreams of studying abroad but gaining something more valuable, a clear-eyed understanding of his father's humanity. The hero worship is gone, replaced by something more complex, but ultimately more real. He works part-time at the hardware store now, the same job his father had, and I've watched them slowly begin to rebuild their relationship on a foundation of honesty instead of expectations. As for the business, we found a solution that nobody expected. David couldn't own it. Dad's will was clear about that, but he could run it. I kept the ownership, the legal responsibility, the final say in major decisions, but David manages the day-to-day operations. He knows the clients, understands the market, has the relationships that make the business work. It's not the legacy Dad envisioned, but it's something we built together from the ashes of his disappointment. The hardest part was learning to live with the knowledge of who Dad really was in his final months, not the loving patriarch we'd always believed him to be, but a man so wounded by betrayal that he chose punishment over redemption. I've had to accept that the father I idolized was human, flawed, capable of making decisions based on hurt rather than love. It doesn't make me love him less, but it makes me understand him differently. I've been going through his personal papers, the boxes of documents and photographs that accumulated over 78 years of life, and I found something that changed everything. Hidden in his desk drawer, underneath the investigator's report and the legal documents, was a letter he'd written but never sent. It was addressed to David, dated just a week before he died, and it was full of the pain and love and disappointment that he'd never been able to express. "Son," it began, "I don't know how to talk to you about what I've discovered. I don't know how to tell you that I know about the gambling, about the money, about all of it. I'm not angry. I'm heartbroken. I'm heartbroken because I failed you somehow, because I didn't see the signs, because I didn't know you were struggling. I'm changing my will, not because I don't love you, but because I don't know how else to protect what I've built. Maybe someday you'll understand that this isn't about punishment. It's about making sure the family business survives, even if our family doesn't." I gave the letter to David on a quiet Sunday afternoon in September, and we both cried as he read it. It didn't change the practical reality of our situation, didn't restore his inheritance or undo the damage that had been done, but it gave him something more valuable, the knowledge that Dad's final act had come from love, not hatred. "He was trying to save the business," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "He knew I'd probably gamble away anything he left me, so he left it to you instead. He was protecting his life's work the only way he knew how." We buried the letter with Dad, a private ceremony at Riverside Cemetery, where we finally said the words that should have been spoken while he was alive. David apologized to the headstone, and I apologized for keeping secrets, and we both promised to do better by each other going forward. The house feels different now, lighter somehow, as if the weight of unspoken truths has finally been lifted. I've kept Dad's study exactly as it was, but I've added new photos, pictures of David and Jake working together at the hardware store, images of Sarah smiling again, snapshots of family dinners where we're learning to be honest with each other about our struggles and our hopes. I'm 68 years old now, and I've learned that families aren't perfect, that love doesn't always look the way we expect it to, and that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the truth, even when it hurts. David will never inherit Dad's business, but he's inherited something more valuable, the chance to rebuild his life on a foundation of honesty and hard work. As I write this, I can hear him in the kitchen, helping me prepare Sunday dinner the way he's done every week since Sarah came home. We're not the same family we were before Dad died, but we're still a family, held together not by money or inheritance or even blood, but by the choice to keep loving each other despite our flaws and failures. Sometimes the most important inheritance isn't what's written in a will. It's what we choose to pass on through our actions, our forgiveness, and our refusal to give up on the people we love, even when they've given up on themselves. The end.